You are listening to Meet the Thriller Author, the podcast where I interview writers of mysteries, thrillers, and suspense books. I'm your host, Alan Peterson, and this is episode number 70. In this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing New York Times and USA Today bestselling author Michael Lister. Michael grew up in North Florida near the Gulf of Mexico and the Apalachicola River. He comes from a small town, and he has a fascinating background. In the early 90s, Michael became the youngest chaplain within the Florida Department of Corrections. He published Power and Blood in 1997, and that was his first novel, which kicked off his John Jordan Mysteries, which he has now recently published the 19th book in that series. I had a great time talking with Michael about his long-running series, about his writing process, and a whole lot more. And a reminder to please review and rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you're subscribed to it. It helps me get the word out for the podcast, and I do appreciate it. So here's my interview with Michael Lister. I'm Peterson here with Meet the Thriller Author, and in this episode I am talking with Michael Lister, who's on Skype. How are you, Michael?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for being on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Can you tell our listeners about your background?
Sure. I've been writing, I guess my first book came out about 21 years ago, and I started seriously pursuing writing about 3 or 4 years before that. So been at this quite a while. My original goal was to get published before I turned 30, and I barely beat that, made that goal, but I did beat that deadline and got right under the wire. And I had always read mysteries and thrillers and really loved the genre and knew that's what I wanted to write. So when I started, that's what I started with, and have pretty much stayed there. I write a few things outside of the genre, but most of my novels are mystery and thrillers. And I live in North Florida, and so that's a huge part of what I write about. That's where the majority of my books are set, primarily in North Florida and in Atlanta, Georgia. I think, there's a lot of influences we can talk about if you want to, but basically I've got one main series going and then quite a few what were originally thriller standalones, but the characters in those have worked their way into my main series. So now pretty much everything I write is related. And my main series is the John Jordan series. There's 19 books in it so far, and they're murder mystery suspense thrillers. When the series opens, John Jordan is an ex-cop, returned from Atlanta to Florida, and is become a prison chaplain and is continuing to do investigation. And then about midway through the series, he becomes a sheriff's investigator again. So that's John Jordan, and that's the series sort of where I started.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. When I first read Power in the Blood, that was the first John Jordan book, right?
Yes,
yeah,
sure was.
Yeah, I remember reading that last year, and I didn't realize that it had been published 20 years ago. So it's amazing.
It was 1997, and I was actually a full-time prison chaplain at the time that the book came out. In 2000, I was able to stop that and start writing full-time. But the last year in 2017, we actually put out a 20th anniversary edition of Power in the Blood, and a really cool book. What happened was I had the opportunity to rewrite it. So essentially, I went back and edited and revised, and kept the original book, but did a lot of revising. And so it's not the 20th anniversary edition is not the book I would have written 20 years ago. And it's also not the one I would write today, but it's a sort of a marriage of those two things. It's got a really beautiful introduction by Michael Connelly, and several other writers and fans of the series have essays and content in the book, and I was really, really pleased with how it turned out.
I noticed that intro from Michael Connelly. That was he wrote a really nice forward for you there.
He's not just a great writer; he's a great person.
Yeah, one of my favorites for sure. It's been so fascinating. I think that's what's been really cool about the John Jordan series is like I said, I didn't realize you've been writing for 20 years, but to follow the different arcs, like you said, he started out as an ex-cop, then he became a chaplain, sheriff's investigator. So it's been interesting to see him grow and change throughout the years.
That's really what appeals to me the most about doing a long series is to be able to, it's almost like I have several mini series within the main series. And I've actually gone back and written 3 prequels so far. So John, when he graduated high school here in North Florida, he moved to Atlanta to really pursue. He was going to seminary, but he was pursuing the Atlanta child murderer and the true crime case that actually took place there. And so that's a big part of the series. But I went back and wrote the 7th book in the series called Innocent Blood is actually a prequel. And so it takes place, starts in 1980 when John actually encountered the Atlanta child monster, the Atlanta child murderer. And then his moving to Atlanta to investigate that. And then the 10th book in the series, Blood Cries, is a sequel to Innocent Blood. It's continuing those early years of John. Stone Cold also is a prequel. So I've got 3 prequels, and then I've got the years in which John was a prison chaplain and an investigator. And then now from book 11, which was Blood Oath, forward, so book 11 through book 19, he's a sheriff's investigator again. He still does part-time prison chaplaincy, but his primary job as an investigator is one in which he's carrying a badge and a gun again, and is an official sheriff's investigator for Gulf County.
And that's Bloodshed is the latest one, right? That's released this last month.
Right, exactly. Yep. And in Bloodshed, John is investigating a school shooting, and local law enforcement are tipped off by the school resource officer that she believes there's a plot for a school shooting to take place. And so they begin investigating before it takes place in an attempt to prevent it. But it deals with sort of the school shootings, what's happening in our society related to those. And so there's a lot about that. But it's got a lot of real information from Columbine forward. But there's a lot. It's a thriller, So there's a lot of fiction in it, and sort of marrying the two, true crime and fiction. But it's also a mystery because in this case, when the school shooting happens, the shooter is wearing a mask, and by the time all the chaos clears, the mask has been thrown aside, and so the school shooter walks out with everyone else, and so they have to, the mystery is who actually perpetrated that crime.
Pretty interesting twist.
Yeah, I wanted to take what's going on with them and then add elements that were new and different, and to not only have a thriller but also have a mystery. I really enjoy mysteries, and all of these books have mysterious and mystery elements. They're whodunits. Most of the time, it's not revealed until the very end. Who actually is responsible for the crime, and get into the psychology of why. In the revelation of who the killer is, and I really enjoy that aspect of it.
Yeah, and I think it's so cool that you were actually a chaplain in the penitentiary, in the prison. I mean, what was that like to be a chaplain in a prison?
It was a really cool experience. It was something I never considered. I mean, it just was not even on my radar. But in North Florida, where I live, in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, they built a lot of prisons in this area. And one in Gulf County, where I live, they built it's just a couple of miles from where I live. A small group of us went out to meet with the chaplain there at the time, and there were 3 of us. We sat down with him, and we were just asking, what we could do to help, and, if we could volunteer for programs and different things. And as we were talking, he looked at me and he said, "You need to be doing this." Talking about chaplaincy. And before that moment, it just never had occurred to me. So within, it was just one of those sort of serendipitous kind of things, because within a few weeks I was doing it. And most of the decade of the 90s, I was a prison chaplain with the Florida Department of Corrections. And that meant I worked with a lot of criminals. I worked with a lot of correctional officers and staff. gained a lot of experience and stories, and I did a lot of counseling and heard a lot of horror stories. And it just was a great foundation for the John Jordan series.
You say you had a goal of being published before you turned 30, but did you always dream of becoming a writer?
From a very early age, I was a storyteller and wanted to always did things within the arts. So I was writing from an early age. I was doing some filmmaking, doing a little music. But as I grew up, really writing became the primary thing. And I just fell in love with fiction, fell in love particularly with crime stories and what crime fiction was capable of. As many writers have said, I'm a reader moved to emulation. So I read books that I loved, and I just wanted to write them. I wanted to write books like those. And so that's what I started doing. And it was in my, it was the summer of 94. I had many in college. I had tried to write. And I did write, but it just wasn't any good. And was having a hard time, for it sort of clicking to fall into place. But I did a graduate program, and it was a modular program, which meant I was on campus just a few weeks a year. The rest of the time I was working from home. And so it required a lot of writing. And when I came to the end of that program and when I graduated, I decided the amount of time I was spending in academic writing every day, I was going to devote to my fiction writing. And I did. And that was the summer of 94. And it just clicked. 3 years later, Power in the Blood was published by Pineapple Press in South Florida, and sort of where everything began.
You have lots of series out there, like 10? I'm looking at your website.
Yeah, I have. I guess I have probably 4 series, and then, like I said, now they sort of it's almost all like they're all part of the John Jordan series. But I have a 1940s noir series set in Panama City, Florida during the World War II, during the sort of on the home front. I've always loved film noir and the classic hard-boiled detective novels. So it's sort of a homage to those. And that's the Jimmy Riley series. And there's 5 of those so far. And then I have a series with a FDLE, which is the Florida Law Department of Law Enforcement. That's like the state cops in Florida. I have a series that involves a female FDLE agent, college religion professor who solve crime together. And then and a few others. But like I say, John Jordan is the main series, and all of those characters that I've written about sort of make their way into the John Jordan series eventually.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I've noticed in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of books published in Florida, crime mysteries in Florida. And it's like northern Florida, the Gulf Coast and all that. It's such an interesting area. Have you been noticing that trend that all of a sudden there's more books now published in Florida?
Definitely, it's interesting because when I first started writing, South Florida was just sort of the capital of crime fiction. It was post Miami Vice era, and there were a lot of writers writing about crime in Miami and in South Florida. And so I was one of the few that was writing about crime, writing crime fiction in North Florida. But now you're right. There's more and more, it seems like writers are writing crime fiction set in all parts of Florida. But really lately, the new parts have been really dealing with Central Florida up to North Florida where I live.
And it really is like 2 really different states, kind of, South and Northern Florida, kind of like California.
No question. It's interesting because the South part of Florida is more like the north part of the United States, and the north part of Florida is more like the south part of the United States. I really live, by living in North Florida, I really live in the deep South. It's rural. It is, a series of small towns, and it is very much a part of the deep South. You can't really distinguish where I live from Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee. Very similar, Louisiana, very similar mindsets and history and that kind of thing.
So who were some of the writers that influenced you then? Before you started to write, you say you were a fan of the genre. Who are some of your favorites?
Well, it really, of course, as a kid, I read Sherlock Holmes and some of the classics. So that was certainly an early influence. In high school, there was a TV show with a private detective called Spencer for Hire. And that's what led me to the books of Robert B. Parker and the Spencer series. And he was a very early influence. And I love the character of Spencer, and I love Parker's writing style. I liked his prose a lot. And so then I just really started investigating the genre and reading more. And James Lee Burke became a huge influence, big fan of his. Michael Connelly, Dennis Lehane, Graham Greene, Walter Mosley, just several. And then, of course, classics, too. I mean, Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett. A lot of those writers, both contemporary and historical, have huge influence on me.
So, from your books in the John Jordan series, did you ever? You say you heard a lot of stories, a lot of horror stories for being a chaplain in prison. Did any of those ever make it into the basis to one of your books?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Fictional versions of things I experienced, while I was a chaplain, and stories I heard. Definitely. In fact, for the second book in the series, which is called Blood of the Lamb, I should say every John Jordan book has the word blood in it. So there's, Power in the Blood, Blood of the Lamb, Flesh and Blood, and on and on and on up until Bloodshed that just came out. But I had the second book in the series written, and then I had an experience as a chaplain with the situation that happened in the prison that I just discarded that second book I had written and wrote another book inspired by actual events that had happened, to me and that I was involved with in the prison. And so that happened a lot. And then I guess maybe that's what has inspired more and more over the years. More and more true crime has worked its way into my novels. Now, these are fiction, it's fiction, and it's not, they're novels, but I have experimented with both using elements of true crime. I've used the Atlanta child murders. I've used the Ted Bundy and what he did, Columbine, the JonBenet Ramsey case, Maura Murray, Hayman Lee, the Adnan Syed case. A lot of cases have made their way into my fiction. And if I am specifically talking about them, then it's factual. I'm using the actual true crime, the real stories and people and factual history. But I marry that with fiction. And so, for instance, in Blood Work, there's a cold case that John is investigating, and he's looking at it very closely. And originally it was believed that Ted Bundy was responsible for it. Ted Bundy, of course, came to Florida and spent time in Florida and was caught in Florida, and ultimately he was executed in Florida. And so I used all the historical events related to Bundy and what he did. And there was a time in which he left Tallahassee and drove across drove west across North Florida to Pensacola and was ultimately apprehended over there. But I used that journey that he was on for an intersection with fictitious characters, and that was the basis of Blood Work. So I've always, I guess, brought in elements of things I've actually experienced and then true crime elements. And until you just asked that question, I guess I really hadn't thought about my early experiences as a chaplain, and using those, true life experiences is probably what opened me up to using more and more true crime in my novel.
And what's the preparation process for that? Do you do like a lot of research before you actually dive into the writing?
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting because early on in the series, in a lot of ways I was living the research. But as the series continued and went on, I've done more and more research over the years. And of course, like I said, when I use the elements of true crime, I do a real in-depth study of the cases that I'm using. But even when everything's fictitious and it's not based on a real case or something related to true crime, I still do a lot of research. And I'm in the extremely fortunate position of having a childhood friend of mine who was in my class, and we actually started school together and went all the way through from kindergarten to graduating high school together. He is the sheriff of the county where I live. And he has been for the last 10 or 12 years or maybe more, the primary consultant for my books. And so, my books now are set in Gulf County, and John works for the Gulf County Sheriff's Department. And it's my friend who is the sheriff of the of Gulf County, and he's just given me so much great information, and I have asked him questions continually. I've also got a really good friend who was an attorney and now has been a judge for several years, and another friend who's a forensic pathologist. So I call on them. Of course, there's all kind of good information in books and online, but these three really provide me with just hands-on details that, their experiences that I really couldn't get anywhere else.
Yeah, especially right in the area that you're writing too. That's a pretty great connections.
It really is.
Is the area, you said Gulf County, but is the town that John Jordan lives and works in, is that real, or is?
Yeah, what happened and I started, like I said, when I was my first novel was published, I was still a full-time prison chaplain, and I had to make the decision if I was going to set the novels in a real place, like the prison I was working in and the town I was living in, or if I was going to do a fictitious. So I made a fictitious town where John is, fictitious prison and all. And so this fictitious town where he lives and the fictitious prison where he works are actually located in and are surrounded by real places in North Florida. And then in the 11th book in the series, which in a lot of ways is called Blood Oath, and in a lot of ways it's really like the start of a new series or the second part of this series. And I moved John to a real location. And so John actually lives now in Weewahitchka, where I live, and is, like I said, works for the Gulf County Sheriff's Department. So actual real places, whereas before I was using a fictitious town surrounded by real places, real towns. Now everything in the novels are set in real places, actual places, and that was a new challenge to do. I've really enjoyed that. And I've continually looked for ways like that to keep the series fresh, both for me as the writer of them, but then also for the readers.
What do you find as a writer? What is there a big difference between writing in a fictitious town versus a real life town? Or
definitely a lot of challenges. Obviously with a fictitious town, you can do absolutely anything you want. Most of the time, it's based on real places and it's fictitious versions of real places you've been and know about. Because it has to be credible and it has to come across as real. But if you need a fictitious business, or you need to move a road or anything, you can do anything with a fictitious town and things like that, that you can't when you're writing about real places. But the real places come with a lot of material to work with. They come with a history, they come with actual, literal, factual events, things you can describe and explain. And so, there's a lot to work with either way, but I've enjoyed both aspects and enjoyed doing both ways. And like I say, it's just really kept the series fresh for me. Speaking of that, I've read series in which I felt like that either the author got tired of writing the series and I wasn't sure why he or she continued, or either it seemed like they were writing the same book over and over and over again. And so I've made a real conscious decision not to do either one of those things. So I feel like there's a lot of diversity in the John Jordan series from a stylistic standpoint, from the stories themselves, my approach, like I said, moving from a fictitious place to a real one and various things like that. And so I'm going to keep it as fresh and interesting and feel like that each book is better than the previous one. And when that stops, I will stop writing the series.
And John Jordan has been aging through the 20 years?
Yes. It's interesting because when I first started, I wasn't sure how I was going to handle that. So in the earlier books, there wasn't a lot of specific references. But when I decided to do the prequel and have John investigate the Atlanta child murders, that's when I specifically set him and the books in actual, time and place. So Um, so then it became, I knew, the audience now, the readers know exactly, when John was born, when he graduated, when he went to Atlanta, when he came back to Florida, all of those things are tied to actual events in history now.
Yeah, I love the John Jordan timeline that you have on your website. That's pretty cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought, again, for a long series, I think it's helpful to do things like that, and you never know when a reader is going to join the series. I've written an essay that's in most of the novels that explains, the best way to read the series, and the three places where I think the three books that I think are the best places to enter the series, which is Innocent Blood, the prequel I mentioned, Power in the Blood, which is the first book that was ever written, or Blood Oath, the 11th book when John becomes an investigator again. Officially an investigator again. But I write them where you can pick up anyone and start. Each novel contains a self-contained mystery that's solved in that novel. So anyway, things like that I think help with a long series, help a reader stay sort of moored to the series and know what's going on, particularly if they pick up a later book and then decide to, go back and read the earlier books later.
And how does it work for you from the writing perspective? Do you have like a spreadsheet to keep track of all the timelines and do you do a lot of outlining before you start to write your stories?
I don't do a lot of outlining. I write, but I guess in terms of just the characters and the events are so, and the novels are so real to me and have been so much a part of my, the last 24 or 5 years of my life and of writing about them, that I feel like I have a really good sense of, not only the characters, but who they really are and their past and their histories. But definitely I do make notes. And if there's something I need to double check, I'll just go back to the text of the novels, and I'm able to look up, and if I need a reminder of exactly when something happened or how it happened. To write a novel, I spend a lot of time. I do my research. I spend a lot of time thinking about the characters and what's going to happen with them, and the mystery and the story itself. And I do make little notes, but not much, and I definitely don't outline. So when I start, I have a good idea of where it's going, and I know a couple of the main things that I believe are going to happen along the way, and I have some notion of how it's going to end, but that's it. And the rest of it, I want to discover it as I go. And I believe that if I'm excited to wake up every morning to get to the keyboard to see what happens next and see how it unfolds and discover things along the way, I hope then that translates to the reader having that same kind of exciting experience with the novels.
And do you set like writing goals when you're writing an active project? Do you say like, I want to write 5 pages today, or 2 chapters, or 5,000 words?
I do. I don't. It's not that specific, but I do. I write when I'm writing a novel, and I almost always am. At this point, I am. When I finish a novel, and then of course I have to do some of the promotional kind of things related to the release or launch of a book. But otherwise, I'm always researching and preparing to write the next novel. And so I take a little time off in between each book to, renew and refresh, but then also to do my research and live with the next story for a while for it to develop in my head at least. And but when I'm writing, that's pretty much all I'm doing. So all day, every day, I'm working on that novel, and so that's just where my focus and concentration is, and it enables me to produce a lot in a short period of time. But most days I will write probably 2 to 3 chapters, but always at least 1 chapter a day, depending on how it goes and how long the chapter is. But most of the time it's 2 or 3, and I don't have a particular word count, but I know feel good about if I get X number of chapters done, then I know I'm making the kind of progress that I want to on the book.
And are you working on book number 20 now on John Jordan?
I am in the research and sort of living with the characters and story mode. So I've not actually started. I mean, this of course is part of writing, so I can't say I haven't started the writing, but I haven't started putting words down on the page yet. I probably have a few more weeks of research and study and prep, and then I'll start the next one.
So that's pretty exciting. Number 20 in the series, huh?
Yeah.
That's quite an accomplishment.
It's because the third book in the series is a collection of short stories. It's the 20th book, but it's the 19th novel. But it's very special. And I've been thinking about, some of the ways in which I can commemorate it being the 20th book in the series.
And so before I let you go, I know some of our listeners are aspiring writers here. Any advice that you could give them with regards to writing?
Well, I would say that when it comes to writing, it really is something that, you learn by doing. And it takes a tremendous amount of effort and focus, and attention. And, Malcolm Gladwell mentioned you have to do something for 10,000 hours or 10 years to get very proficient at it. And there are no shortcuts. I mean, you have to, it's a very idiosyncratic endeavor, and you have to study it, but you mostly have to do it. And you learn to do it by reading good books and breaking them down and studying how they work, but then mostly you do it by writing. And if you'll commit to write and write, try to write consistently every day if possible, and then get good feedback so you can learn and grow, and be open to that good feedback and be willing to change things that need to be changed. Then you can figure it out, and you figure out how you do it, how it works for you. By doing that, by figuring it out yourself, once you do, then I feel like you really know how to do it. There's a lot of great books, there's great courses and things, but ultimately, we're the ones who have to figure out how to write, and in doing that process really prepares us and teaches us to be able to do it well. But it's not quick. There are no shortcuts.
Yes, that's great. And then for the listeners to find you, your website's michaellister.com.
Yes, michaellister.com, and that's has most everything, that about the series and the different projects going, and how to get them and that kind of thing.
Yeah, you have a lot of cool stuff in there. You have like merchandise too. Like,
I really like some of the.
That's pretty awesome.
Some John Jordan merch, and
the videos are really cool too. The trailers.
Thank you. Yeah, we've made a lot of trailers for the books over the years. There's interviews. There's an interview Michael Connolly and I did a couple of years back that's on there. A lot of good material, especially for if people are fans of thrillers and mysteries and aspiring writers. I think they'll find something that will be of benefit for them.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Meet the Thriller Author. I'd like to ask you to please review and rate this podcast over on iTunes. It really helps me get the word out. If you take a few seconds of your time to do that, it would be much appreciated. You can also visit my website at thrillingreads.com/podcast for show notes on this episode, as well as information about the podcast in general. And you can also sign up for my mailing list there. You'll be getting special offers from our guests, as well as information, behind the scenes information on the podcast. And please do visit my author website at alanpeterson.com. I appreciate your support. And so until next episode, I will talk to you then.